Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sprint 215 review. This is a normal 2-week sprint ending on June 26th, and let's get started. I'll start with the overview, Jeffrey on the UI, Adam on providers, and Joe on the platform. As you can see, this sprint, we're back to normal cadence. Last sprint, we had a blast out of the Renovate tool from Mend, which was all those open PRs, but this sprint, we're back to normal. As you can see, there were 30 bugs addressed, 15 enhancements, 10 tests, and a smattering of others. And over to Jeffrey with the UI.
Good morning. In Sprint 2 and 5, there were 6 bug fixes, 2 enhancements, and a few other PRs that got merged into the classic repo. And I can explain about them in the following slides. The performance charts found in the monitoring utilization pages are supposed to have dates and times on their x-axis, but the dates were being formatted into integer, which was breaking all of the charts. David had fixed this by changing the type of one particular object from integer to date, and that solved the problem, and now we are able to see all the charts. Next slide. Earlier, the authorization page had the breadcrumbs as overview timeline. Jason had removed this breadcrumb and introduced proper titles for the authorization error page. Next slide. While loading the physical provider overview page, we used to get some error notifications when the page is loaded with no providers. Gilbert fixed this bug by adding additional checks for the status cards. Next slide. The text in the data tables were truncated before, and we couldn't see the entire text for a few cells with longer text. So we were only able to see this by hovering on particular truncated text. And we made a fix for this issue by refactoring the MIQ data table component, and we can see the entire text now. Next slide. The host initiator form page was throwing up an error because of the props called is searchable was present before, and it was because of this, it was sending the provider name instead of provider ID. The AutoST team had made some changes in classic and corresponding provider report to fix this issue. Next slide. So David added a button helper file for the embedded workflows to be used in workflow pages in future. Next slide. There was an issue reported regarding the summary pages that it was not readable in some cases. So we made a few enhancements in the MIQ structured list component. So now it looks much better than before. Next slide. Gilbert had made some changes for Cypress test cases, and he removed some unnecessary test cases based on the data availability, and he added cases for the logout feature, updated the search box test cases, and fixed menu test cases in case of an empty database. Yeah, that's all from the UI side. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So for core of this sprint, we added a default set of params to attributes for all embedded automation manager authentications. Previously, each class had to define this, otherwise they weren't able to save credentials from the API or the UI at all, when it was pretty simple to just go through the set of defined DDF parameters to figure out which column should be allowed to be set. So we did that in the base class. After that, we had to fix up the embedded Ansible SCM subclass so that the parent class was set properly. And so with that, we're able to save credentials on the UI and API for workflows and embedded Ansible. We made a fix for checking if the EMS is enabled before calling perf capture or perf capture timer. This just prevents queue items from being run or put on the queue if you have paused in EMS, so that you don't flood the queue with perf capture queue items. For AutoSCE, they fixed an issue with the host initiator parameters. As Jeffrey mentioned, there's a bug in the picking the group and the cluster field. For IBM Cloud, Jay added a retirement setting for Power BI VM provisioning. So there's a tab for that you can set retirement settings. And we also fixed a missing system profile dropdown for VPC provisioning. The previous one was on the general tab, but when you change the name to instance type, it had to be on the hardware tab in order for it to show up on the UI. Next slide. For Kubernetes, Joe fixed a refresh thread error where the join timeout value was a duration and it had to be a float. This was causing errors on Ruby 3. It was working on 2.7 and fixed on 3.1, but we're on 3, so we have to fix that. So that was a nice fix there. We are also now checking if the metrics authentication is valid before running a perf capture. So again, if your OpenShift doesn't have valid metrics authentication, we're not going to waste any time starting to run any of the perf captures, only to fail later. And for OpenStack, we fixed a cloud network delete error that was the result of some core refactoring and then adding an options parameter that wasn't available in the OpenStack raw method. And so we got that fixed up there. Next slide. And for workflows, as it said, we are able to now create credentials via the API and the UI for workflow SCM and standard type credentials. And Jason added a fix to seed the workflows EMS, even if the prototype is disabled. This just makes it easier for you to turn it on later without having to restart everything, because it would require a reseed in order for the provider to show up if you did turn the prototype on. For the flow gem, which is what runs the workflows, we added the ability to pass options to the Docker runner class, which makes it possible for you to set things like the Kubernetes token and other options like which namespace you want to put the containers in for Kubernetes. We also added a context class, and the fields in that are trying to be as similar as possible to the standard AWS Lambda context that you get. We also split out the workflow run and step so that you can get finer grain control as the caller on how you want to run the workflow. And we fixed a bug on Kubernetes where trying to set a numeric environmental variable, Go would fail to marshal that because it was expecting the value to be a string. So we just 2S all the environment variable values. And we also fixed a bug where on Kubernetes, it was creating a secret even if no credentials were passed due to safe navigation and unless, which I should try to avoid because that's surprising behavior. That is it for providers. Over to Joe.
Okay, thanks, Adam. For platform enhancements, Brandon split up the GitHub action in appliance build to run the build jobs in parallel, and he handled all of the complexities with doing this. Next, Keenan changed the simulate queue worker to simulate the actual order we process queue messages, and he also added some helpful output. Keenan also added some virtual attributes enhancements around binds in associations and virtual totals for has and belongs to many associations. In ManageIQ password, Jason directly exposed key as an attribute reader and alias 2S to it, as it was not obvious that this was in the public API previously. Jason also made some enhancements in the CI setup for virtual attributes. And finally, Keenan refactored the Vim performance state finders based upon the convention they all followed. Next slide. For platform bugs, this is technically a bug enhancement, but Keenan improved the rollup child metrics by limiting the performance states records to only ones relevant to the desired object. Keenan also fixed 2 bugs in virtual attributes around binds and uses. I fixed a bug where the normal priority reports were not being run in the reporting worker, and therefore likely sitting behind other slow non-reporting work. Next, I fixed a bug where the server shutdown would attempt to raise a stopped event before quiescing workers and roles. And this would prevent quiesce from actually running if the event creation failed. Then I fixed another bug where you were not able to delete an inactive zone that had many unprocessed queue messages. And finally, I fixed a bug in the IPA certmonger code where we're using the same principal name value in commands that needed or didn't need the realm appended. This was changed to two separate named concepts so clients can choose which one they need. And this is what was done. Next slide, back to Jason.
All right, and that's it for our Sprint 215 review. Our next review, Sprint 216, will be on July 12th at the usual place and time. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone in the community for their contributions, thank all our presenters today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.